I got it. Well, she wasn't even at the window, so I figured you guys would have had her. Oh, she would have had, yeah, she would have had, she had worked with that. Unless I'm getting up around mine too much. I'm around mine too much, I just forget. I'll see you later. Okay. So that's
time for the young ones to do that, but they're not committing. Talking to Bud Hoover, he's Brownstown, and he was saying the same thing. All I do is watch till he retired from the funeral. All I do is watch them. So all we need somebody to do. Coming. The only time we use is cologne. It's a funeral cologne. They smell the same. See, they go too often.
Nice meeting you.
Like 6 games. I see it. They could put it in paper. They just
This side or the other?
They were only about a mile from here.
All right, well, for anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Alex, and I was asked to do this service today. I want to thank everyone who's here to support the Kohr family. This was such a great, there was a lot of people coming through the door, so it's clear your presence is a testament to how loved Bob was. And this is truly my honor to have been asked to be the celebrant for today's service. Oftentimes, when I'm asked to perform a celebrant service, I do not personally know the person. In this case, that's what I originally thought, and it wasn't until I was sitting in the Kohr's kitchen with Deb and John looking through old photos that I had the realization that I did know Bob. I just didn't quite recognize him because it's been a few months. I happened to say, he looks like a guy I knew from Bill's Diner, to which they said, well, he did go to Bill's, and I asked if he drove a large brownish red truck and if he would always be wearing a camo hat, and they all said, yeah. Well, it turns out I knew Bob. I don't know that he ever actually gave me his name, though, so he was just kind of the guy that was there. Here it turns out I've known Bob from Bill's for a little over a decade. I meet a group of older women for coffee in the mornings, and when I would walk out of the diner, I'd stop at their table to talk, just because we were there by association, so we kind of blended. Now, before I got to know Bob, I would refer to him as the serious-faced man whenever he came in, because I don't think I ever saw him smile there, so I was like, okay. I knew Ralph from the service for the Dauphin County Honor Guard, so we would always talk where he had a funeral that day, where he was heading, and so on and so forth, and Bob wouldn't really say anything, so I was like, I wasn't sure if he didn't like me, or if I felt like I was interrupting their conversation. It wasn't until I realized that if he didn't like me, I would have heard about it. But I realized that he wasn't a huge conversationalist, and that if he didn't like me, he would have told me right off the bat, from what it sounds like. As I got to know him more and more, he would always greet me, and we would talk for a little, and he went from the serious-faced man to Bob. As we talked about what Deb and the family envisioned for Bob's celebration of life, they said he wasn't necessarily religious, so they wanted a service that focused more on his life. They said something along the lines that they were fearful if they were in a church the roof might fall in, but that's beside the fact. Deb did ask if I could say a prayer, and when I thought about what Bob would have liked and what his interests were, I found the perfect prayer. It's called A Hunter's Prayer by S. Eliot. We pray our sights to be straight and our aim to be true. We pray for no pain for the game we pursue. We thank thee, Lord, for this land. We thank thee for the sights in our stand. We pray for safety, one and all. We pray we may return next fall. That just seemed more appropriate than a traditional. When I meet a family, the first thing I ask them to do is describe their loved one with some adjectives. Some of the words that were used to describe Bob were a character, humorous, resilient, honest, and a perfectionist. I was told that you never quite knew what was going to come out of Bob's mouth or what he was going to say next. And that's something his grandchildren loved, his sense of humor, because it was something so out there and so unexpected coming from him that you just couldn't help but laugh. Todd mentioned that the things he would say would be hilarious without him actually intending them to be. I'm sure many of you can recall at least one of Bob's one-liners that made you laugh at some point. Some of them might not have been appropriate, I heard, but Bob was a man of a few words, but you never had to question what he meant by that. All his family agreed that if Bob had something to say, he was not going to beat around the bush or hold back. If he didn't like you, he would tell you, and that was that. He had absolutely no time for people who lied, and even less for pettiness. I think it was Todd who said he didn't speak just to speak. He chose his word carefully and deliberately. I would stop by their table and say hi, and I would get a hi back. So then I'd say, well, how are you doing? Fine. It wasn't until I asked him how his tomatoes were doing that he became talkative. In fact, his tomatoes and garden became a perennial topic when I saw him. But he was definitely a listener. As Ralph and I would talk, and Ralph is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of Bob, he and I would talk, and Bob would just sit there, so sorry, Ralph, but he led the conversation mostly. And he would just sit there and take everything in. Occasionally he would interject something or have an opinion on something, but for the most part, he just listened. For anyone who has ever been to their home, it doesn't take long to realize that Bob was a perfectionist. Their backyard is immaculate, and everything's so perfectly placed and symmetrical, I was just amazed. We were talking about how some people seem to go out and take care of their yard, and guys get fixated about length and all that, and they'll go out there with scissors and trim it. And Deb said that was her husband. So he transformed their yard into essentially a wildlife sanctuary. Everywhere you looked, there was wildlife. I stood in Bob's cabin room that was definitely his cabin away from his cabin, and looked out in disbelief at the sheer quantity of birds that were just flocking to the trees and the feeders. Deb said that his yard was one of his personal sanctuaries. She also said there was only one time that they got into a disagreement over the yard and its inhabitants. Bob shot a squirrel, and Deb found out about it. Well, as Deb was sobbing, Deb told him that if he ever shot a squirrel again, he was out. Needless to say, all the squirrels are still safe to this day. As Bob was less able to do the things that he used to, John took over the feeding duties. Deb said that he was specifically trained by Bob when he was young on how to properly do tasks the Bob way. The day after Bob passed, Deb looked out through her window, and a single deer was in the yard. She and I both agreed that Bob was coming back to let her know he was okay, or maybe it was to supervise John that he was still doing things the way he wanted him to be. Todd said that Bob was strict when they were growing up, but not in a bad way. It was a very structured way. They all had chores to do while he was at work, and they needed to be done before he got home. Todd said that they would do them, and you would always know that when he got home, they would never be done correctly to his liking. But they still kept doing them. I said that one thing that always stood out to me was how perfectly even and trimmed his beard was. That's a weird thing to say, but it was always just perfect. I said, his family just laughed and said that his precision and perfectionism didn't stop with his property, but also his appearance. Deb's best descriptor of Bob was that he was a man's man. Bob gave the appearance of a tough guy who just looked like he should be out in the woods somewhere. He loved spending time with his friends and family, and whether this was at breakfast or during his trips to the cabin. He was a man who loved the taste of Keystone and Coors Light. Can't say that's my taste, but hey, everyone has their own. Deb said that he was one of those people who he would be having a conversation with someone he knew in public, and she'd be standing there behind him, and he would never introduce her. So eventually she'd walk away and figured he'd find her, and when he did, he didn't understand why she wasn't there, and she had to try to explain to him that she was just left hovering awkwardly in the background. I don't think he ever did this to be rude, I just don't think he ever realized that he should probably introduce his wife and family whenever he was talking to people he knew. Bob's favorite place was his cabin in Huntington. It was his 18 acres of paradise. I learned that he built the cabin by hand out of debris from the '72 flood, which is pretty amazing. I'm in awe of people who know how to just seem to build things. He built a shed in the backyard, and that's also a testament to his abilities, because the shed is absolutely beautiful and nicer than some people's homes. The cabin was an essential part of Bob's life. He went there with his friends and family, more so with his friends, I was told. Deb said she'd go occasionally, but she wasn't a fan of the outhouse, especially at night, so I can see that being a problem. I don't blame you. Here he could just relax. John said that every weekend from April to January, they would go and hunt for whatever was in season. For the slideshow, the family wanted to choose photos that highlighted his passion for hunting, and as I'm sure you saw, there was a lot of various animals and beer and alcohol in front of them whenever he was at the cabin. While Bob wasn't necessarily known for smiling, in most of the cabin photos you can see he has at least a smirk on his face, so he must have been happy. While he gave the appearance of a stoic mountain man, I learned from Deb that he developed a secret liking for cats. Bob was by no means a cat person and always said he hated cats. It wasn't until he was more homebound that the cats forced themselves upon him and made him love them. Miss Kitty, I think, is Miss Kitty the one that would wrap her tail around his legs, and that was his sign to lightly pull it playfully, and she'd run away and then come back as he was sitting in his recliner. Even though Bob could be seen as this man's man, I just can't see him enjoying cats or interacting with animals. I think it shows how good his heart was. And I'm sure he would deny it if he was here that he ever would play with a cat, but Bob's greatest passion was the love he had for his family. Bob adored his grandchildren, and Deb, John, and Todd said he was the perfect grandfather. That's quite a title. He had an unmistakable smile on his face, and it was actually a smile. Every time there was a photo of Garrett, of Maddie, of Kyle, I think he was on the floor more than he was anywhere else with all the kids. Words cannot describe how proud he was of all of your accomplishments. And as you continue achieving success, which as I learned from your family, it sounds like you all will, your grandpa will be right there cheering you on. Everyone in the family agreed that his grandkids are what kept him young at heart. He also loved his sons and daughter, as well as his siblings Tom and Joanne. Unfortunately, Tom passed away this past April, but I have no doubt they're reunited with one another now, having a great time. At this time, Bob's family wanted to say some words, and who should know better than Bob's family about Bob? So I'm going to turn it over to Todd first.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you all for coming today to celebrate the life of my dad, Bob, Big Bob, Happy, Slip. I don't know where that name came from, but he had lots of nicknames. I'm sure maybe you had some others for him as well that I might not be aware of. But speaking of nicknames, and I may regret saying this because they might come back to haunt me, but his nickname for me was Yak. And not the big, cow-like thing in the Himalayas. But he called me that because when I was born and when I was younger, I had really, really blonde hair. And I reminded him of a cartoon duck, Yacky Duck. And so I found a text from him, and it was a birthday one, happy birthday, Yacky. And so even into my 60s, he still would refer to me as Yak. I do want to acknowledge those who couldn't be here with us today, but they're watching via live stream. So I know my brother Tom and his wife Debbie out in Fife, Washington, are viewing. Deb's sister Marge, also out in Washington State, and Deb's brother John and his wife Eileen in Florida are watching as well. I don't know if you know of anybody else, but I know those three for sure. But you know, as Alex mentioned, everyone who knew my dad knew how much he loved the outdoors and hunting and fishing, and in fact, while all my friends were going to the beach for the summer for vacation, we were doing state parks and national parks. And Yellowstone versus the Jersey Shore, I don't think we made out that bad, right? But it does show you why I have such a love for the outdoors and sort of have carried that with me as well. We also know, and from Alex's comments, his love for his cabin in Huntington County. It was literally his favorite place on the planet. And I know a lot of you here have memories of weekends there or hunting trips there. So, I often think about, so it's been like 60 years since they built that cabin. I often think about that. So there was this group of young men from Middletown, Pennsylvania, and they were sleeping in tents and building a cabin in the mountains of central Pennsylvania with no electric, no plumbing, and no running water. How they were building an entire cabin with no electricity, think about that. They all had to be hand tools, and so I think that's pretty badass, right? Like, I really think that they could have made a Discovery Network movie that show out that. They have those ones that are like about the homesteaders and things like that. I think that would have made a pretty cool show. And they used the all salvaged wood and windows and doors from when Homestead Air Force Base closed and they were tearing down the housing. He went and gathered all that and saved it, and that's what they used to build the cabin. And over the years, our neighbors, and we have some of them here today, our neighbors at the cabin became like another family. And he really enjoyed spending time with them and attended their weddings and their graduations, and sadly even some of their funerals. But I'm glad he could be here today to help celebrate his life. But what came, and Alex's comments mentioned as well, that his greatest love was really his grandkids. And Alex also alluded to the fact that he was strict. And he was really strict. He was a very strict parent. But not with his grandkids. Like, that was a whole other story. So that was, it actually was really, I loved watching him interact with his grandkids and how joyful he was and how different he was. He was very patient and kind and extremely funny. And we kind of already talked about those happy one-liners that you just didn't know when they were coming or where they were coming from, but of course, we just all busted out laughing when he did. And I'm glad that he was able to see his grandchildren grow up, and I'm glad that they've had 20 years of their life to be able to spend with him and create those memories. And we all wish we had more time with him to create more memories. But even now, those little things will. And I was just in New York for work, and I went to a deli for breakfast, and they served the coffee in a really thick mug, like a heavy, thick mug. And it immediately reminded me of the coffee mugs at the cabin. You guys, you remember, they had like 60 years of coffee stains in them, and they were just really heavy. And so that was like a memory of me getting a cup of coffee with him in the morning and watching the deer or whatever wildlife would come out on the yard. And speaking of the mornings, we all know that he liked to get up really early in the morning, and he went to bed very early. So he would get really mad when others would stay up and play loud music when we were at the cabin and just carry on. And but he got his revenge. Because in the mornings, he woke up early in the morning, and he would go into the kitchen and start banging shit around. I mean, it sounded like a whole family of raccoons got into a cabinet and were rifling through everything. But back to the cop. So it's moments like that that will continue to come. We'll continue to have those memories. We won't be able to make more moments with him, but we'll be able to remember, and you'll have them too. So at this point, I would like to introduce my daughter, who's going to come up and say a few words.
Hi, my name is Madeline, and I'm Bob's granddaughter. Most of you knew him as Bob or Robert, but to my brother Garrett and I, he was always Pappy, and occasionally Papa Whappers. That was a name for him. Growing up, every time we would go over to visit our Grammy and Pappy, he would greet Garrett and I with Mexican hats, which were our favorite candy, and every Christmas and birthday, we would always receive a big bag of Mexican hats, and it was always the best gift that we got. It was a candy unique to Pappy. Most other people had never heard of it or tried it before, so it was always just something that I'll always associate with him. Other people have said this, but one thing that my Pappy was known for were his classic one-liners. They were always the highlight of every family gathering. And another highlight of family gatherings were his love for my dog Moose. My dad often told me that when he was growing up, Pappy didn't allow their dogs in certain parts of the house. He was very strict with the dogs. This could not be further from the Pappy that I knew. Just this past Christmas, Pappy and I were standing at the appetizer table, and we were spoiling our meal with, like, I think it was shrimp and crackers and cheese and all of that, and every other bite, my Pappy would pretend to drop something. Just drop a cracker or something, and he would hand it right to the dog. He'd go, oops, I dropped it, and just hand it right to the dog. And that led to every holiday, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, our dog would have his head resting on the arm of Pappy's chair. He just knew that Pappy was the most likely person to feed him straight from the table. And this soft spot that Pappy had for our dog, it was only amplified when it came to my brother and I. He was always incredibly patient and indulgent with us, and I feel incredibly lucky to have had him as my grandfather. As most of you know, my Pappy was an avid outdoorsman. Hunting, fishing, and even just walking through the woods were some of his favorite things. And of course, watching the birds. Just as my dad said, Pappy's love of the outdoors transferred to him and eventually to me, especially through his trips to Maine. My Pappy went on so many trips throughout Maine to fish and spend time in the great outdoors. As I currently go to school and live in Maine, I loved hearing about his stories in the Penobscot Bay region and Acadia National Park. These are both places that are not too far from where I live now. We would go on and he would tell me about his travels, and I would tell him about my adventures. I'd recognize so many of the places that he had been, and we would just go back and forth talking about our adventures in the same area of Maine, 20-something years apart. It was just a really special moment that I had with him. Every time I take a walk through the woods or cast a fishing line, I will forever be reminded of my Pappy and his love of the outdoors that I inherited from him. My Pappy has always been a steadfast figure in my life, supporting me through every milestone. I would not be the person that I am today without him, and I'm eternally grateful to have had him in my life. And I think my Aunt Amy wants to say a few words.
Okay, I'm Amy, I'm Bob's stepdaughter. I'm fortunate to have had Bob in my life. I'm sorry. He was like a father to me. I met him when I was 10 years old, which means I've been lucky to have 40 years with him. He helped shape who I've become. I'm thankful that he has been in my life. He was known as Big Bob, Geezer, and Maddie and Garrett would call him Papa Robbers. Bob was a simple man. He was quiet, but when he laughed, his laugh would be infectious. When he smiled, it was the biggest smile you would get, and it was a very cheesy grin. He loved his family, his wife, children, and grandchildren. He was a dedicated hunter, loved spending time on his cabin. He loved nature, planting flowers, vegetable gardens. He loved bird watching, walks in Keller Field, always looking for wildlife. Even when he was driving, he would slow down and almost stop the truck so you could see what he saw. And speaking of that truck, he drove slow. really slow, and no matter where you were going, he liked to take the back roads. So you know you were in for a ride of your life. It was going to be a long trip to get to where you were going. He read the newspaper and faithfully watched the news every day at 12 o'clock and from 4 to 7 p.m. He developed a love for reading, specifically James Patterson. He loved his sweets, Mexican hats, vanilla milkshake, chocolate candy, cookies and pie. He loved a hot dog, fish and chips, iced tea, and his Coors Light. He listened to country music, and believe it or not, he loved Cher. He loved going to breakfast with his friends every Friday at Bill's. Growing up, I have many memories. He took me fishing on his boat. Speaking of his boat, that was when he told me the story of how he lost his hair. He said he was drowning in the river, and his friends pulled him out and pulled the hair right off his head. And I believed him for many, many years. He watched me cheer at football games. He watched me graduate high school and college. I was fortunate to have lived with my mom and Bob when I was on summer break from college. Those summers, we would take walks in Town and go to the Fireman's Carnival and take weekly trips to Woods Market. When I went to buy my first car, he helped me every step of the way. I'll remember the countless hours, happy hours with my mom and Bob at the Borough. Sometimes she would have to drag Bob and I out of the Borough. I'll remember all the conversations, mostly, that we had out in the backyard in the gazebo. Whenever you talked with Bob, he was a straight shooter. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was always good advice. I could tell him anything and he would listen. He never judged me, never questioned me, never questioned my decisions, and never ever made me feel that I wasn't important. Now, if you knew Bob, he had some strange different names for things, and I called them Bobisms. So one was, instead of calling like your socks, he called them stockings. His underwear, he called them underpants. If someone was bald, he said they were ball-headed. So back then when Oprah Winfrey had a talk show, he would always say, "Oh, look, Oprah Whitney's on." And sorry that I'm going to say this, but when it's cold outside, he would say, "It's colder as a witch's tit." But the best Bobism of all was the nickname that he gave my mom. He called her Bird and Birdie because of his love for birds. So, whenever I'm outside, Bob will think of you. Anytime I hear the birds chirping, I hear the leaves rustling in the wind. I smell the fresh dew on the grass, or watch a beautiful snowfall with cardinals in a tree. Whenever I see a deer, I know you'll be watching over me. Whenever I need immediate comfort, I know what I can do. I'll put on a baseball hat, pull it snug on my head, as it was a hug from you. Bob, I will always love you. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that would like, the family invites anyone else that would like to share a memory to come up to the microphone? Okay. Is there anyone that wants to come up or speak from their seat? Well, those were really beautiful tributes, and it definitely shows how much Bob meant to everyone, especially his family. I encourage you, like Todd said, to continue sharing the memories you've had of Bob with his family. I'm sure they'd love to hear stories. I understand, like I said, some of the stories might not be appropriate for a funeral, so if you couldn't say them up here, I understand. As our celebration of Bob's life comes to an end, there are a few takeaways I want to leave everyone with, and these are qualities that Bob lived by. Whether he knew it or not, they were definitely ingrained in his life. First, always live life to the fullest. Bob did what he loved and made so many friends along the way. He made time to hunt and fish and enjoy life. He did not sweat the small stuff or give in to pettiness like it's so easy to do. 2, never lose your sense of humor. Bob's sense of humor may have been dry, but it was undeniably present. I am sure everyone here today can remember multiple times when Bob said something so off the wall, yet so relevant to a situation, that you couldn't help but laugh. Laughter is the best medicine, after all. Finally, always make time for your friends and family. Bob understood the importance of being there whenever his family needed him. While he had his own way of doing things, and most likely your way was not his way and therefore was wrong, he was there to pass on his knowledge. After seeing the pure love that his grandchildren, kids, and wife have for him, it is clear that he was the definition of a family man and someone we should all strive to be. One last poem that seems so appropriate is entitled Cardinals. It's said that they fly in from the heavens to remind us that the loved ones we've lost, we've not lost at all. They can be seen everywhere around us, just in joyful new shapes and forms. And if you notice, the little pamphlet you received all had cardinals on the front of them. Every time you see a cardinal, I want you to take a moment and remember Bob. While I was at his house looking out through their backyard, a brilliant red cardinal came to feed right in front of the window. Even though life is going to be different, and the new normal of Bob not physically being here will take time to adjust to, I have no doubt he will still be watching close by and sending you constant reminders of his love. Thank you again for coming to support the family through this difficult time. We will start dismissing in the back. The family